He pulled the dog out of the swamp, risking his own life. But at home, things turned out differently. His heart gave out, and he lost consciousness. The dog ran off into the night and brought back a doctor, who arrived just in time. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The morning light was slow to rise, seeping through the worn curtains of the old wooden house like a hesitant guest. Inside, the air carried the faint smell of tobacco and wood smoke, mixed with the sharper note of medicines stacked in small brown bottles on a shelf near the bed. The veteran stirred, not from comfort, but from discipline, as if, even after decades away from the battlefield, his body refused to let him linger in sleep. His joints ached, his chest carried that familiar tightness, and his legs moved with the heaviness of a man who had carried too much for too long. Yet there was no question about what he would do next. By the door, waiting in quiet stillness, sat the one companion who never needed to be told what time it was. The dog, grizzled and scarred with age, lifted his head as soon as the veteran swung his legs from the bed. His eyes, clouded slightly by years, still burned with awareness, with a readiness that seemed to defy time itself. He had been with the man through darker days, when the sounds of war filled their ears, and the air itself had tasted of metal and fire. Now, in the gentler silence of civilian life, he remained just as vigilant, as though guarding his master's every breath. The man took his time, pulling on his boots, every movement deliberate. He looked briefly at the walls, where framed memories clung like stubborn shadows. Photographs of his youth, medals pinned on simple wooden plaques, faces of men long gone who had once been his brothers in arms. All of them seemed to watch as he prepared for the day's ritual. He tightened his coat against the lingering chill of dawn and opened the door. The dog rose immediately, tail swishing with quiet anticipation. Together, they stepped outside. The forest waited for them with its breath held. A thin mist drifted between the trees, wrapping the world in soft gray. The air was sharp, filling the lungs with that biting freshness that could both hurt and heal. The earth beneath their boots was damp, layered with fallen needles, and leaves that gave a muffled sound to every step. For the veteran, these morning walks were not a luxury, but a necessity, a promise he had made to himself long ago. As long as he could walk this path, as long as he could move through the trees beside his loyal companion, he knew he was still alive. The dog trotted a few steps ahead, ears twitching at every rustle, nose to the ground. His pace carried an energy that belied his age, but there was also caution in the way he paused to look back, as if measuring each step against the slower gait of the man who followed. The veteran leaned heavily on his cane, though he hated admitting to himself how much he relied on it now. His pride would not allow weakness to take the form of stillness. Better to strain and stumble than to surrender to the silence of a chair. As the path curved deeper into the woods, the man let his eyes wander. The forest had always spoken to him in ways words never could. He noticed the glisten of dew on thin branches, the hurried flutter of a bird disturbed by their presence, the way the mist clung to the undergrowth. There was peace here, but it was not the kind of peace that made one forget. It was a wary quiet, a reminder that nature, like war, could turn without warning. He had felt that truth too many times to ever ignore it. The dog halted suddenly, nose lifted, body tense. For a moment the man's breath caught. He followed the animal's gaze, but saw only the thickening fog, shadows shifting between the trees. Perhaps it was nothing more than a deer, or a fox, stirring from its den. Still, unease crept into his chest like a whisper he could not silence. The dog moved again, but slower now, tail low, steps careful. The man frowned. He knew this behavior well, had once trusted it with his very life. Dogs sensed danger before men did, and though the war was far behind them, he could not shake the habit of listening. He pressed on, letting the rhythm of his steps anchor him. The cane sank a little deeper into the soil than usual, as if the ground itself had softened overnight. He glanced at the roots of the trees, twisted and half exposed, and thought about the heavy rains from the week before. Perhaps the land was shifting in ways unseen. The thought pricked at him, a small seed of worry, but he pushed it aside. He was no stranger to unease. It had lived in him so long, it felt almost like an old comrade. The dog's ears flicked back toward him, a silent check, and then forward again. His breath puffed in quick bursts into the morning chill, white clouds that vanished into the mist. The veteran steadied himself against a tree for a moment, feeling the damp bark beneath his palm. His heart thudded, steady but strained. These walks tested him more each day, yet he would not give them up. There was too much at stake, too much history woven into every step he took beside that dog. They had survived because they had refused to stop moving. Silence deepened around them. The cries of crows cut through it, harsh and unsettling, echoing overhead. The man tilted his head upward, following their black shapes as they wheeled above the treetops. He felt that familiar sensation again, a faint warning he could not explain. The forest seemed to watch them, holding its breath, waiting for something unseen. He gripped the cane tighter, and the dog pressed closer to his side for a moment, before pulling ahead again. The trail was familiar, worn by years of footsteps, yet today it felt altered. The veteran noticed the faint shine of water pooled in hollows, the way the air grew heavier as they advanced. There was a scent, too, sharp and unpleasant, like earth turned sour. He furrowed his brow. The dog's movements grew restless, darting left and right, paws scuffing at the ground as if searching for something. The man slowed, allowing his body to register the unease that pressed against him. He had learned long ago never to dismiss instinct. Danger, he knew, did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it came as a silence too deep, a stillness too heavy. The forest this morning carried that weight. He drew in a breath, tasting the dampness in the air, and wondered if perhaps they had wandered closer to the marshlands than usual. The dog paused again, head lifted, eyes narrowed into the mist. The veteran followed his gaze, but once more he saw only the endless stretch of trees fading into gray. He shook his head and urged himself forward. The day had only begun, and yet something told him it would not be like other mornings. He pressed on, each step a reminder of his limits, each glance at the dog a reassurance of his strength. They were bound together, two veterans scarred by time and memory, walking side by side into whatever the forest held. Neither of them could know that this quiet ritual was about to be tested, that the bond, forged in war, would soon be measured once again in a battle not of bullets and fire, but of mud, breath, and life itself. The mist thickened, the ground softened, and with it the feeling of foreboding grew. Yet still they walked, unaware of how swiftly the forest could change, how quickly a path of habit could turn into a trial of survival. The forest had grown heavier with each step, the mist thickening until the trees seemed to bend closer together, their branches arching like watchful sentinels. The air was saturated, wet and clinging, and the veteran felt the weight of it settle in his chest as he moved. The path, once firm beneath his boots, had softened into a spongy ground that gave with each press of his cane. He was aware of it, aware too of the way the silence of the woods had changed. It was no longer the stillness of dawn, but the kind that came before an accident, or worse, before battle. It pressed against him like an old warning, one he didn't want to acknowledge, but couldn't ignore. The dog was restless now, his movements sharp and uneven. He darted forward, sniffing the damp earth with intensity, then glanced back at his master before plunging deeper into the fog. The man tried to call him back, though his voice was low and rasped by years of smoke and shouting. The animal paid little mind, compelled by something unseen. The veteran followed as best he could, his breath already uneven, his grip tightening on the worn handle of the cane. He had trusted this dog with his life before, in darker places than these woods, and though the years had dulled both their bodies, he knew that instincts did not fade. There was a sudden noise, muffled but sharp, the sound of something breaking beneath weight. Then came the frantic splash, the guttural yelp, and the veteran's heart leapt into his throat. He pushed forward with all the strength left in his legs, stumbling over roots, cane striking the ground harder than it should. Through the thick curtain of mist, he saw it, the dog's body half submerged in a patch of earth that was no earth at all, but water and mud, a treacherous mire that pulled with greedy hands. The animal clawed desperately, his chest sinking deeper, his eyes wide with panic as the swamp swallowed him inch by inch. The veteran froze for a heartbeat, and in that pause, every old instinct surged to the surface. He had seen men caught in worse traps, quicksand, collapsed tunnels, smoke-choked rooms, and he knew hesitation was death. His body moved before thought, powered by something older than reason. He tore the leather belt from his waist, the buckle clanging against his fingers, as he looped one end tightly around his wrist and the other around the exposed root of a tree. Then he dropped to his belly, the cold mud seeping through his coat, and stretched the length of his body toward the struggling animal. The dog flailed, his cries muffled as muck dragged at him, but his eyes found the man's, and there was recognition there, a plea not for life alone, but for the bond that bound them. The veteran's hand shook as he thrust the leather forward, his arm trembling with the effort of holding himself above the sucking ground. The dog's teeth caught it, weak at first, then stronger as instinct to survive overwhelmed panic. The man pulled with all he had left. His muscles screamed, his shoulders felt as though they might tear, and his chest burned with a fire that reminded him too keenly of years past. The mud resisted, slurping and dragging at the animal with a strength that seemed unnatural, as though the swamp itself did not want to let go. The veteran's vision blurred, sweat stung his eyes despite the cold, and every beat of his heart came like a hammer blow. Still he pulled. He anchored his body against the roots, boots digging into the shifting soil, his hands raw from the leather cutting into his palms. Slowly, agonizingly, the dog began to rise from the mire. First his shoulders broke free, then his chest, and with a final desperate heave, the veteran dragged him onto solid ground. They both collapsed there, side by side, covered in filth and trembling with exhaustion. The dog lay gasping, his sides heaving, his tongue lolling with effort. The man rolled onto his back, his lungs seizing, his heart pounding so violently he thought it might break free from his ribs. The forest returned around them, its silence now a mocking witness to the battle that had just been fought. The mist swirled lazily above, as if indifferent to the struggle that had nearly cost a life. The veteran raised one shaking hand, and the dog, still quivering, pressed his muzzle into it. It wasn't a gesture of submission, but of recognition, of gratitude, written in the only language they both still trusted. The man closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to hold himself steady. He could feel the deep ache spreading in his chest, a heaviness that was not entirely from the exertion. He knew his body had limits, and he had just tested them cruelly. But none of that mattered now. The dog was alive. That was enough to silence his fear, at least for the moment. After a time, he forced himself to rise. His legs wobbled, his cane sank into the soft ground, as if mocking him, but he stood. The dog pushed himself up too, shaking mud from his coat in great sprays. Together they turned back toward the faint outline of the trail, moving slowly, cautiously. Each step was labor, but the veteran's mind clung to one thought only. They had survived. Whatever the forest had meant for them, it had not succeeded in taking what he cherished most. Still, as they walked, the man could not ignore the warning signs his body gave, the stabbing tightness in his chest, the dizziness that swam at the edges of his vision, the way his breath came shallow and fast. He told himself he would rest once they reached home, that it was nothing but the aftermath of the struggle. Yet deep inside, a voice he could not silence whispered that he had given more than he should have, that his body had crossed a threshold it might not recover from so easily. The dog moved beside him, no longer darting ahead but keeping close, as though he understood. His head lowered, his gait slow. Every so often his shoulder brushed against the man's leg, steadying him. Their bond was wordless, forged not of commands, but of survival, and it guided them both through the woods that had turned suddenly hostile. The mist began to thin as they neared the edge of the trees, the shapes of distant rooftops barely visible through the gray. The veteran let out a long breath he had not realized he was holding. The worst was behind them, he told himself. Soon they would be back in the small house, safe in its warmth, where rest and routine could smooth away the scars of the morning. He clung to that thought with stubborn hope, unaware that the trial was far from over, that the swamp had not been the end, but only the beginning of the test awaiting him. The house came into view just as the fog began to loosen its grip on the forest, revealing the familiar line of rooftops in the distance. The veteran's shoulders sagged with a mixture of relief and exhaustion, every step feeling heavier than the last. His boots squelched with mud, his cane dug awkwardly into the softened ground, and his chest rose and fell with a harsh, uneven rhythm. Beside him, the dog trudged quietly, no longer darting ahead or sniffing with curiosity. Instead, he kept his master's pace, ears tilted back, his body brushing against the man's leg as though he feared that the old soldier might collapse at any moment. The swamp was behind them, but its grip had not fully let go. The mud clung to their clothes, to the dog's thick coat, to the air itself, as though the forest wanted to follow them home. When they finally reached the porch of the small wooden house, the veteran paused to steady himself. The cane shook under his weight, and his breath came in shallow bursts. He told himself it was only fatigue, only the strain of pulling a heavy animal from a pit that wanted to devour it. He had pushed himself too hard, yes, but he had done so many times before in his life. Still, as he bent to unlace his boots, his hands trembled, and his vision clouded briefly. The dog whined low in his throat, nudging at the man's elbow, sensing what he would not admit. Inside, the house was warm, with the lingering scent of yesterday's fire in the stove, but its comfort barely registered. The veteran lowered himself into the old armchair with a groan that carried more than physical weight. His body sagged against the worn cushions, and for a moment he closed his eyes, intending only to rest. The dog circled at his feet, shaking off dried mud, then settled with his muzzle across the man's knee, watching with anxious eyes. Silence filled the room, broken only by the uneven rasp of the man's breathing. It did not take long for the silence to grow heavier, darker. The man's chest hitched, his hand slid from the armrest, and his head fell back against the chair. The dog stiffened, ears pricked, and nudged at him again. There was no response. The animal pushed harder, pawing at his arm, whining louder now, then licking his face with frantic urgency. Still nothing. The man remained slumped, his skin pale, his lips drawn tight, as if the very effort of breathing had abandoned him. The dog paced the floor, nails clicking against the wooden boards, his whine rising into a bark. He bounded to the door, scratched at it, then rushed back to his master's side. He pawed again at the unmoving hand, as though sheer insistence could rouse him. But when the man gave no sign, only a shallow flutter of breath, the animal froze, head tilted, as if listening to something beyond the walls. Then, with a suddenness born of instinct, he leapt for the door, claws raking the wood until the latch gave way. Into the night he ran, his body a streak of dark urgency against the pale wash of moonlight. The town was not far, a small cluster of buildings where soldiers and their families lived, where the memory of war lingered in every corner. The dog's paws beat the dirt road in a rhythm that echoed with desperation. People turned to look as he streaked past, his coat still caked with mud, his bark sharp and insistent. Some muttered, others called after him, but he'd not slow. He knew where to go. At the edge of the settlement stood the old infirmary, a squat building of faded brick and narrow windows. Inside, a single lamp still burned, casting a weary glow on the desk, where a man sat bent over paperwork. The medic, himself a veteran of many campaigns, rubbed his tired eyes, the silence of his post-war duty gnawing at him. He was not expecting visitors, least of all the sudden crash of paws against the door and the furious barking that followed. He looked up, startled, and frowned at the sight of the mud-covered dog on the threshold. At first, he thought the animal lost or hungry, another stray drawn to the smell of warmth and food. But the barking did not cease. It grew sharper, filled with a kind of urgency that no ordinary animal would carry. The dog darted forward, teeth catching at the fabric of the medic's trousers, tugging hard, then releasing to bark again. He circled toward the door, paused, then ran back to seize the man's sleeve. The medic tried to shake him off, irritated, but then something in the animal's eyes caught him. It was the same look he had seen once in the field, when trained dogs pulled men away from death under fire, when their instincts had saved lives in places where human courage faltered. The barking grew more frantic, echoing in the small room, a sound that carried more than noise. It was a plea. The medic hesitated, torn between dismissal and belief, but the urgency in the dog's movements overcame his doubt. He grabbed his bag, still packed with instruments and vials he had long grown weary of carrying, and allowed himself to be pulled into the night. The dog led the way, running ahead a few paces, then stopping to look back, making sure the man followed. His tail flagged high, his body taut with desperation. The road back to the veteran's house was short, but felt endless. The medic's boots pounded the dirt, his breath fogging in the cold air. Memories rose unbidden, of nights when he had been led not by animals, but by the cries of wounded men through smoke and chaos. He realized he was following the same rhythm now, the rhythm of trust in something beyond explanation. By the time the small house appeared out of the darkness, his heart was hammering as hard from dread as from exertion. The door was ajar, left swinging from the dog's earlier escape. The medic pushed inside, the smell of mud and damp wood thick in the air. His eyes fell on the figure in the chair, slumped and still, chest barely rising. The bag dropped onto the floor as instinct took over. He was at the man's side in seconds, fingers pressed against the throat, searching for the flutter of life. It was there, faint but fading, like the last glow of an ember before the wind could snuff it out. The medic's hands moved with the precision of memory. He opened his kit, drew out what he needed, and began his work. The dog stood close, whining, pacing, then settling again with his head low and ears flat, as though praying in silence. The veteran stirred only once, a weak flutter of breath, before the medic forced air into his lungs and steadied his pulse with practiced care. The room filled with the sharp scent of alcohol, the quiet clink of instruments, the sound of effort against the pull of darkness. The crisis unfolded without words, only the rhythm of labor, of one man fighting to drag another back from the brink. The dog did not move from his place, eyes fixed on both men, his body tense, as though he understood every motion, every sound. Time seemed suspended, stretched into an eternity of shallow breaths and hurried hands. And yet, slowly, the ember caught. The chest rose more steadily. The pulse beneath the medic's fingers grew firmer. The pale face flushed faintly with the return of life. The medic sat back at last, sweat dampening his brow despite the cool air, and let out a long breath he had not known he was holding. The dog lifted his head, ears pricking, tail giving a single thump against the floor. The veteran still lay weak, unconscious but breathing, his body no longer so close to surrender. The medic looked at him with the weary recognition of one who had seen death and defied it too many times. He glanced at the dog then, and for the first time in years, felt a flicker of wonder. Without the animal, the old soldier would have been gone by now, another casualty in a war that had ended long ago, but never truly released its grip. The night outside pressed against the windows, silent and heavy. But inside the house, life had been reclaimed. The dog curled finally at the man's feet, his eyes never leaving his master's face, his body tense even in rest. The medic leaned back, fatigue pulling at him, but allowed himself the brief comfort of knowing he had arrived in time. For now, the battle was won. Yet in the hush of the room, there lingered the weight of what had nearly been lost, and the quiet acknowledgement that this wasn't chance, but the bond between a man and his dog, forged in war and proven again in peace. The house was quiet except for the soft crackle of the lamp on the table and the steady, fragile rhythm of breathing that had returned to the veteran's chest. The medic sat hunched forward on a chair, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the man he had just dragged back from the edge. His own pulse had only just slowed, the adrenaline ebbing away to leave the familiar ache of exhaustion. He had seen death too many times to mistake how close it had come tonight. Without the dog's frantic insistence, without that relentless barking in the cold night air, the veteran would have slipped away in his sleep, gone before anyone could have known. The medic exhaled, his breath audible in the silence, and glanced toward the animal. The dog had not left his master's side. He lay curled near the chair, his mud-stained fur matted, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes wide open, glowing in the dim light. He had not slept, not even blinked for long stretches, his gaze following every shallow rise and fall of the man's chest. Every so often he let out a low whine, not of fear, but of vigilance, a sound that kept reminding the medic of the battlefield. He had seen animals do this before, refusing to abandon a fallen comrade until help arrived. It was loyalty that went beyond instinct, something raw and enduring that no war, no peace, no time could erase. The medic leaned back at last, running a hand over his face. He remembered the moment of hesitation at the infirmary door, the thought that this was only a stray gone mad. Had he ignored it, the man before him would be lifeless now. The memory made his stomach twist. He reached for the canteen at his side and took a slow sip of water, letting the coolness ease his dry throat. Then he studied the veteran again. His skin still looked drawn, his breath uneven, but the danger had receded. It was no longer the fragile flutter of life about to vanish, but the slower, steadier rhythm of a body finding its way back. Hours passed in this fragile state, the night stretching long. The medic stayed awake, watching, making small adjustments, pressing his fingers to the pulse at the man's wrist, reassuring himself it was still there. The dog's eyes never wavered. At times, it seemed as though the animal knew more than either of them, as though he alone had the strength to hold the world steady until morning came. The medic wondered, not for the first time, whether such creatures carried something greater than men could understand. He thought of all the times he had watched soldiers fall, and how many might have lived had they been carried to help with the same desperation this dog had shown tonight. When dawn came, it slipped gently through the window, painting the room in pale gold. The veteran stirred, his eyelids fluttering, and a faint groan escaped his throat. The medic straightened immediately, leaning forward to check his face, his eyes, the sluggish movements of his limbs. Slowly, painfully, the man began to wake. His gaze unfocused at first, then sharpened, and the first thing he saw was the dark shape at his feet. The dog had risen in an instant, pressing his muzzle against the man's hand, tail thumping once, twice, before stilling again. It was not the wild joy of a pup, but the quiet relief of a companion who had stood guard through the night. The veteran's lips moved, though no words came. His throat was too dry, his body too weak, but the look in his eyes said more than speech ever could. He reached down with trembling fingers, brushing against the rough fur, and the dog pressed closer, eyes closing for a moment in contentment. The medic watched this exchange in silence, understanding it was not his place to intrude. This was a conversation older than language, forged in mud and fire, tested once more in the quiet struggle of survival. The hours that followed were slow but steady. The veteran regained some strength, enough to sit upright with help, enough to drink water and swallow a little food. The medic explained, quietly and simply, that his heart had given out under the strain of the swamp, that rest would be his only salvation now. He spoke with the bluntness of a man who had no use for false comforts. The veteran nodded faintly, accepting what he already knew. His body had betrayed him, but it had not broken. And it had not broken because of the animal sitting faithfully at his side. Later, as the sun climbed higher, the medic found himself staring at the two of them together and thinking of all he had lost, all who had not made it home. There was something in this bond that defied the bitterness of memory. He saw in it a kind of circle. The man had given everything he had to save the dog from the mire, and the dog had given everything to bring help when the man fell. Each owed the other their life, and together they formed a wholeness neither could have found alone. The day wore on. The medic prepared to leave, promising to return with more supplies and to check on the veteran daily until he was stronger. As he gathered his things, he paused in the doorway and looked back. The man was resting again, his breathing steady now, and the dog lay stretched across his feet like a sentinel. The room glowed softly in the morning light, carrying none of the fear and urgency of the night before. For the first time in years, the medic felt something close to peace. Outside, the forest waited, calm and indifferent. The swamp still lay hidden in its depths, silent and hungry, but it had been defied. In the quiet of the small home, in the bond between an old soldier and his faithful dog, something stronger than fear had taken root. It was not victory in the sense of battles won or enemies defeated, but a quieter triumph, one that spoke of endurance, loyalty, and the unbreakable thread that tied two lives together. That night, when the lamp was lit once more and the house settled into silence, the veteran stirred in his chair and let his hand fall to the warm fur at his side. He felt the steady breath of his companion, and with it came the certainty that he was not alone, that as long as they walked together, there would be no swamp, no darkness, no silence too deep to overcome. The forest could hold its secrets, the years could weigh down his bones, but the bond they shared was unyielding. In that bond was salvation, and in salvation, the quiet truth of life itself. If this story spoke to you, Make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more powerful stories you won't want to miss. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.